think I shall have to stand on my tiptoes so you can see me over the top of the podium. I think it's an occupational hazard for somebody who's only 5'3". Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here among such an august audience. And what I'll be doing is looking at some of the economic issues surrounding Britain and the EU, where we are and where I would like us to be. That doesn't mean to say I'm not interested in the non-economic issues, but I do think that for those of us who want a different relationship for Britain and the EU, we have to make a very strong economic case that actually we would get outside the EU, outside full membership of the EU, we would be better off than if we remained within it. I'm glad some people agree with me. But we need to be able to kill those myths, kill that propaganda, that somehow if we left, we would be a little economy, a minnow of an economy that would bob around on the waves of the North Atlantic until we sank beneath them. And believe it not, I've heard certain Lib Dem MPs actually say that we'd just be bobbing around on the North Atlantic. How absurd is that? I think the first thing to do is remind ourselves, as if we need reminding, that we actually still are an important economy. We're still a big economy. Fair enough, there are those economies that are coming up, obviously China, Brazil may or may not have overtaken us in GDP terms in 2011, but we are still one of the largest second-tier economies after the United States of America, the People's Republic of China, Japan, Germany, and possibly France, and possibly Brazil. I think it's just worth reminding ourselves of that. And the second thing to remind ourselves of, that we are still a very, very important trading nation. Again, we probably are about 6 in the actual league table of trading goods and services, after saying the same sorts of countries that I've already quoted. We are a very important trading nation. But while we're on the issue of trade, I would just like to drop this idea that last year we got figures from the Office of National Statistics that we were running quite a big trade surplus or current account surplus with the rest of the world. But where did that deficit, current account deficit with the rest of the world, but where did that deficit come from? It came from trade with the EU. We were running a deficit with the EU of over £50 billion, whereas with the rest of the world, the non-EU, we were actually running a surplus of about 16 billion. Just think of that, a deficit of £50 billion. And so when people say to you, oh, but you know, we hold these 3 million jobs that are dependent on trade with the EU, or just remind them that in fact a lot more jobs in the rest of the EU depend on trade with us than depend in this country on trade with them. It's a big imbalance, and it really does mean that we've got quite a bit of negotiating power because of that. And I think the third thing I would like to say is that you only have to look at something like the City of London to realise that we have almost unique international trading links, partly because of history, partly because of our outward-going nature. We are essentially a global country. We made the modern global world. And that still is a very important driver in the way this country thinks and functions. And before I move on, I would just like to say make one or two remarks about the Commonwealth, which I think is an unjustly neglected part of the world economy. In fact, as an economic bloc, the Commonwealth is rarely discussed. I think the idea is we think ourselves of Europe and we seem to ignore what else is out there. But the Commonwealth actually is a very important economic bloc in its own right, or it could be. We have over 2 billion people live in it, of course a lot of them in South Asia, but 2 billion is a third of the world's population, about 15% of the world's GDP. And because of cultural ties and historical ties, it's estimated there is advantage for dealing with other Commonwealth countries that may be worth 15% of the price or the cost. And that's been estimated in the wake of a meeting of so-called CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting that met in Edinburgh in 1998. And I think the other thing I would say about the Commonwealth is it's not a thing of the past. People just think, oh, it's the end of empire. If people talk about the Commonwealth in favourable terms, you're just trying to recreate something that went on a long time ago. But nothing could be further from the truth, because the more you look at the Commonwealth countries, you realise that they're the countries that are going to have a great future in the 21st century. That is absolutely undeniable. Whether you look at India, or you look at Australia, or New Zealand, or Canada, these are countries that have everything in a way going for them, not least of all the demographics. In all of those countries, the working population is expected to rise quite comfortably over the next 40 years, according to the United Nations. Whereas let's just look at some of the figures that you look at the EU by comparison, where you actually have a terrific demographic deficit coming up. Germany's working population is expected to fall back by 25%. 25% by 2050. Italy's by 20%. Spain's by 14%, whereas ours should rise a little bit. So you see, there you have it. The Commonwealth is not the past. The Commonwealth is the future. The Commonwealth countries could be the future for us if we could unshackle ourselves from the customs union of the EU and make free trade agreements with the Commonwealth countries. Yeah. So that, I'm glad there are a few people who it's really quite comforting. It's a change from here on BBC. I just say, while I'm at it, I've not come here to condemn the EU, and this isn't meant to be Shakespeare or anything, if you understand it. But let's just think again of perhaps in the 1970s, perhaps joining the EU might have been a sensible thing to do. Because at that time, it did appear to be a growing part of the world economy. It was a very important part of the world economy. Even in 1980, the EU 27, as it is now constituted, was over 30% of world GDP. Over 30%. The United States of America was about a quarter. 2010, where is the EU share now? Is 20%. It's dropped from 30% to 20%. And according to the IMF, it will be less than 18% by 2016. It will be smaller than China. Back in 1980, China's share was 2%. And that tells you, again, of the enormous pressures there are on the EU. This is an economic bloc in relative economic decline. There is absolutely no doubt about it. And for us to shackle ourselves, as we are doing, to something that is declining, strikes me as not a very sensible idea. And it is the kernel of any arguments that you or I make when we are trying to persuade people that we could actually be better off out of this thing than staying inside it. The world is changing. It's not just what's happening now, it's what's happening in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time. The world will be a very different place, except I think one thing we can say with relative certainty is that the EU will be even less important than it is today. So we need, as a country, to think forward. Having said that, let's just look at some of the so-called costs and benefits of current membership. Now, unfortunately, the British government, in its wisdom, has never actually undertaken a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis. I wish it would. I really wish it would, because I'd like to see what they'd come up with. But we know that various people have made estimates, and even 5 or 6 years ago, they were saying that the net costs to Britain of membership, all in all, could have been 3.5% to 4% of GDP. But one thing we do know is that we are a net contributor to the budget. Okay, in 2010, £8 billion, but it's growing. And it's growing because the budget is growing of the EU, and indeed, no doubt, our abatement will come under target again for the next financial perspective. So if there's any doubt in my mind that we will be pouring more and more money, just in terms of net contributions, if nothing else, over the next 5 to 10 years. And £8 billion. Why should it £8 billion? What could you do with £8 billion? Quite a lot. You could give it to me for a start. But why throw this money away? And it's interesting that the Swiss federal government had one of its sort of fits of, I'm not sure whether it's enthusiasm or not, for the EU back in about 2006. And they estimated that if they, of course they've got a relationship now with the EU, They estimated if they actually became a member, their net contributions would actually rise sixfold. So if we had a Swiss-type relationship, and we paid in proportion as much as Switzerland does, instead of paying £8 billion to the EU, we might be paying £1.5 billion at the most. Even that, we'd be saving nearly £7 billion. This strikes me as quite a good idea. But in a way, those net contributions are only a minor part of what I believe are the costs on the British economy of membership. I mean, I've already hinted quite broadly that we are in the customs union, and that does mean, of course, that the Commissioner negotiates on our behalf if there are any free trade agreements or any other agreements that are taking place bilaterally with the rest of the world. And of course, they negotiate on behalf of the EU 27, they do not negotiate on behalf of the United Kingdom. But the problem is, again, could we have the sort of free trade agreement we wanted to with Australia or New Zealand or the United States of America even? No, we couldn't, because we're locked inside the customs union. And so there are these opportunity costs now of not being able to have the trading relationships we want or we should have with some favoured nations that are going to be the future of the world economy. That's the first thing. The second thing is my own favourite, the single market. How many times have I heard from people, oh, the single market is the jewel of the crown? Well, I used to watch that television series as well. But some jewel, some crown. That's all I can say to you. Because we know there are some benefits of the single market, but there are costs as well. And the costs almost outweigh the benefits by a factor of 2 or 3. Even on commission figures. I remember Günther Verheugen, who used to be industry commissioner back in the mid-2000s, estimated the cost of the single market even then, and this was before they started to tackle the financial services with such vigor, cost about 600 billion euros throughout the EU. And what were the benefits? 800? 1,000? 2,000? 240. In other words, the costs outweigh the benefits by about over 2 to 1. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't think that's a terribly good deal. And of course, you and I know that when it comes to single market regulations, they're decided by QMV. We have 8.5% of the vote, and probably next to no influence, especially when it comes to financial services, just in case people haven't noticed that, but it's true. So 8.5% of the vote, and I think it's estimated, I think it was Lord Treisman who said that of all the regulations that affect business in this country, about half of them of economic significance come from the EU. And there is nothing the British government can do about those regulations. So it will not surprise you to hear that I'm not a complete supporter of the single market. In fact, let's be frank about this, it's not a good idea. We should be out of it. And I have, as I say, indicated the financial services because obviously that's something I'm fairly close to. And that in particular worries me because there seems to be such a concerted attack in Brussels on the financial services on the City of London, which just happens to be our true jewel in the crown in the British economy. Earning 35 billion sterling in net exports, and of course the financial services themselves, all in all, contribute about 11 or 12% of tax revenues to the British Exchequer. The City of London is very, very important to the British economy and a considerable threat from the enthusiasts in Brussels. And I could go on and on and on, but enough, I shouldn't indulge myself too much. I will not discuss the common agricultural policy, or the common fisheries policy, or the renewables directive. It is simply too painful. But, new relationship. Where should we go? Clearly, I think I made this very clear already, actually. It's actually clear. The status quo is not where I would like us to be. I would personally like to see us with a Swiss-like relationship with the EU, in other words, outside the EU, the political structures of the EU, but in a trade relationship with certain mutually beneficial bilateral agreements. Now, how do we get there? I mean, some people say, oh, reform, let's reform the EU. Well, I don't know about you, but I really don't think that's a starter. Oh, should we repatriate powers, say others? Well, I think that's not a starter either. I mean, the brutal truth is, of course we have to leave, of course we have to renegotiate, and of course we have to put on the table what sort of relationship we would like. Now, of course, some people say, oh, they won't let you have this and they won't let you have that. Well, may I just take you back to the beginning of my speech when I was talking about this 50 billion trade deficit with the EU. Do you really think that Mercedes and Volkswagen, whoever has it, they are successful German motor car companies, would like us to just turn our backs and walk away? Of course they wouldn't. In economic, it's in their interests that they would make the sort of negotiations that we would like to see. And so that is where I would like to be. Swiss-like relationship within the EU, and of course then, because we'd be outside the customs union, we could then start building out these free trade agreements with Commonwealth countries, with the United States of America. We could be part of NAFTA. So NAFTA, instead of being the North American free trade agreement, would be the North Atlantic free trade agreement. And when we're in that sort of relationship, do you think we'd be isolated? Do you think we'd be shunned? Do you think investors would turn their backs on us as part of NAFTA, as having free trade agreements with successful Commonwealth countries? I don't think so. I'm afraid to say those questions are rhetorical questions because I do believe the answer is almost certainly no. We'd be better linked in to the world economy as it is now, and much better linked in to the world economy that will be over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. We must look ahead. We must look ahead to the future of this country. Thank you very much.